everyone, and if you're listening to this straight after publication, Happy New Year! This is the Edtech podcast, the show about new ideas in education, teaching and learning, and I'm Sophie Bailey. I'm editing this on the way down to Worthing for a Big Tots New Year's Eve rave-up, so apologies for any background noise if this sounds a bit strange. This week we've got the remarkable Stephen Heppell, teacher, professor, learning and learning technology specialist and sailor extraordinaire. In this episode we talk about why it's important to let your 2-year-old show off their fish fingers at the dinner table, the early days of learning and technology.
I could have taken the internet home on a memory stick.
And what happens if we neglect the optimum conditions for teaching and learning?
The kids, they are literally gassing themselves with their own emissions, really.
We also talk about why students should go to university earlier.
Folk listening to this are their kids do their music grades. Nobody ever says you can't do your grade 8 piano until you're 14. You just do it when you're ready. Stage, not age. Just let the kids go as fast as they can.
Stephen's makerspace project for Syrian refugees.
Climbing out over the bodies of your classmates is a pretty humbling thing.
Challenging the comfort zones of leaders.
The times when our most successful project happened were, to be honest, Sophie, when I woke up in the middle of the night trembling with fear that I'd gone too far. I still go into schools now where they're trying to confiscate the phones, and I think, stupid fool.
And the current political climate.
And we clearly are still struggling with educational fundamentalists.
But as we head into 2017, Stephen's message is one of positivity and a call for all of us to embrace the opportunity of new ways for teaching and learning.
It's an exciting time, I think, for most of the folk listening. This is going to be the best ever decade for learning.
You can check out all of these themes and more at Bett 2017, where Stephen will be speaking at the Higher Education Summit. I wish you all the very best 2017, full of challenges, adventures and lots of love. Take care, everyone. Hello, is that Stephen?
Hello, Sophie. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you doing? Are you on your boat?
No, I wish I was, actually. This time of year, the boat has lots of work to do on it, so it's still in the water, but we sail around to St Catherine's around about, just after Bett, usually.
It's just because I saw all the wood panelling in the background, so I thought maybe you were in your...
no, that's just, I'm in the study. That's just the guitar that I wish I could play.
Yeah.
Well, I wish I could play well. No time. I'm probably better. There's a puppet hanging on it. I'm quite good with a puppet. I do quite a lot of Skyping to small people from here, so there's quite a lot of little puppets around, of course.
Is that family?
Both really. I have my grandchildren live with me, so that's really rather lovely. I enjoy that. But I've got projects all around the world, and a lot of them are in very, very early years settings, as well as, I kind of work with kids of all ages, really. Any learner's a learner, so do a lot of university stuff, do a lot of preschool stuff, and...
I think my son, so he's just turned 2, and we do sometimes do Skype with the grandparents, and it doesn't take long for something suddenly to become a puppet or to come into view.
Because I think my top tip for Skyping to grandparents is do it at mealtime and just leave the phone on the table. It just becomes, they become like the marmalade, and they just sort of chat to them. And otherwise, it's a bit of a faff for a 2-year-old to talk to an old person. It's not actually all that compelling, And they've had enough pretty quickly. But if you leave them on the table, they'll sort of show off their fish fingers and chat, and it all becomes very natural. So, I'd go for that if I were you. It's good.
So I'm delighted to be speaking with Stephen Heppell, double L, for those who ever struggle, because I'm terrible at those kind of things.
Gosh, yes, Sophie, I belong to a Facebook community of people who always have to spell their names when they say it. So anybody listening with the same problem, welcome to my world.
Welcome to your world. And Stephen, you've been involved in education for a long time and seen the sort of cycles of innovation and government workshops and support happen in this area. So
Sophie, that's secret code for saying I'm really old.
No. So that that means.
It's true. I was very lucky to be involved with computers as an undergraduate, really, when you had to wear hairnets and go into a room with funny slippers on. And it seemed to me at the time they were pretty important. And then, of course, as the government started to think they might be helpful in schools, I was teaching, and the number of people who knew about computers and were teaching kind of was about one hand, sort of 5 or 6 of us. So I've been doing it ever since, really, and gosh.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of my segue into, just if for those listening who aren't familiar with what you've been doing over those years, is it possible to just give a kind of whistle-stop tour?
Blimey. Well, we've only got half an hour. We'd need about a year. But a couple of the quick things. I mean, it was very apparent, I think, early on that this wasn't just about content. It was about people making and doing. And I think when we had the very first computers and kids were programming them, and we were doing artificial intelligence and robotics and all the things that are suddenly now very fashionable, it was pretty obvious that kids making and doing were necessary. You can't critique something until you can deconstruct it. You can't deconstruct it till you can construct it. So most of my life has been kids doing stuff and people thinking it's not about the children, it's about some jolly big company somewhere, and they've always been wrong. So, and early on for a while I was the biggest producer of CD-ROM in Europe. We were making tens of thousands of CDs that were, programs that were written by children and teachers and others, and the sort of multimedia era. We connected up all the kids in Essex and Hertfordshire using electronic mail, as it was then called, and teletext, it all felt like the future,
We've only just given up teletext on the Isle of Wight, that's a modern. I remember teletext.
Yeah, well, the Isle of Wight's still waiting for the Sound of Music, I think, but I'm still hugely fond of the place just because of all the sailing, of course, I sail around it most years.
Yeah.
And then we came on, of course, the beginning of the internet, and I remember when my daughter was Juliet, who's now, of course, in her 30s, still a teacher. Her first web pages on the internet had huge readership, and I think at that time, this was 95. The code had only been released that year for the web. I could have taken the internet home on a memory stick at that point. There were so few pages. Had we but had memory sticks in those days. And now of course I've got lots of interesting projects. I've got all the children in Wales on Hub, our big online community. I've got projects in the refugee camps for kids doing makerspace activities they're sharing with kids in Europe. I've got an endless master's degree where you belong to the community but you never actually finish. You just pay a monthly membership. That's all starting in the new year. We've got our little Internet of Things, big data, Learnometer boxes measuring the physical environment. But in the end, it's all about empowering children to make learning better themselves with the tools they've got. 2.2 billion kids in the world. We're never going to make learning better for them. I'm not even sure we can make learning better with them, but they sure as heck can make learning better themselves. And they need our help, and they need technology to do that. So, I'm in a rather nice position of having said the same thing for 30 or 40 years, and turns out, blow me down, I was right, which is quite nice, where I can feel pretty smug.
One of my questions here, which is, I suppose, rather crass. If you had a magic wand, what would be the one thing you would change in education today?
So I think you can divide the world up into two groups. There's one group who are saying, we want yesterday and we want it cheaper. Can we use adaptive testing to do the work of teachers or whatever? And the other lot, and I think these are probably less in Europe, they're more in the Pacific Rim, and certainly not in North America, or not in the United States. I'd be doing, I think, Canada a disservice. These days, Canada's going pretty well. So the rest of the world then are saying, never mind yesterday, we want tomorrow, we'd like it sooner. And curiously, there's nobody saying we'd like tomorrow sooner and cheaper. And I guess if we're going to really impact on the 21 million displaced children in the world, on the 60 or 70 million that don't even go to school, on the billion or so, 50% of children having a bad experience, education has got to be not a shiny version of the past, but it's got to be tomorrow's learning, and it's got to be affordable. And that means we've got to do it more cheaply than we've been doing it in Western Europe. And that doesn't mean we've got to cut the costs the hideous way that some parts of the US have done it. There are gorgeous schools in the US and there are gorgeous schools here, but they tend to be one-offs. And it's very hard for them to scale, because they get... I think the fundamental problem is if you build a really stunning school, I'm thinking of places like High-Tech High in the States or School 21 here or whatever, for people to admit that they're good, people have to admit that they were wrong, and it turns out to be really hard for people in charge of education to say, you know what, I was wrong. Learner-led learning is more effective. Mixed-age teaching does help the little ones go faster and the older ones reinforce their understanding. Technology-rich learning means throw away some of the things that we used to do that weren't technology-rich, And stage, not age, sounds a lot more seductive than making everybody wait at the end of every year for everybody else to catch up, And to admit that that's right is to say, I'll tell you what, everything else was wrong. And that's a very hard thing. So, if I could wave your magic wand, Sophie, I'd just take us forward 20 years or so, and then we wouldn't have that worry. I think the same thing happened in health. There was a moment when it was pretty obvious that drilling holes in people's heads and slapping leeches on their foreheads and sticking their truncated limbs in boiling tar wasn't really going to solve the problems, and what we actually wanted was hygiene and nutrition,
Well, I suppose we've moved on from caning and, there's...
Yeah, exactly, but it's very slow progress. And I think in health, it took half a century before people stopped drilling holes in heads, and when we clearly are still struggling with educational fundamentalists, who sort of, we would insist on streaming and setting and doing things that 100 years of research says actually it doesn't work, but they keep on doing the equivalent of drilling holes in heads. I mean, it's quite interesting. So I do a lot of work with the British Olympic team, and folk listening to this in North America will remember the Atlanta Olympics, when we, Team GB, famously got one gold medal, which was Pinsent and Redgrave, and we were terrible, really, People turned up and they did their thing, but it wasn't very competitive. And we got one gold medal in the whole Olympics. This year in Rio, 27 gold medals, over 60 medals in all. Team GB second in the league table. And I know we've lost some of Russia and China to drug testing and so on, but by and large, that came from looking at the marginal gains, the aggregation of marginal gains. How can we make sport better? Well, when you apply that to learning, it turns out that we haven't done very much of that yet, and our little Learnometer box, nice example. It's a little box, sits in the corner. It's a cheap enough box to build. It's a research project. It measures the light levels and the CO2 and the temperature and the heat and light and everything else, really. Humidity, air pollution, air pressure, and so on. And when you actually start running the thing, you realise that most kids are being taught in the most hideous conditions.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the subjects I used to really enjoy talking to you about, actually, is thinking, well, what environment are they sat in? How does that physiologically affect their learning? Because I think that's what you're specifically speaking about within the Higher Education Summit. And I noticed, I think you had a Kickstarter on Learnometer. So definitely finding out a little bit about that.
Yes, let me say a little more about that. I mean, the Kickstarter, we pulled the Kickstarter because we were given... we had a very useful conversation with JISC, who of course runs SuperChanet and EduRome and all the things that keep British universities alive, really. And they said, you've got a little gadget there that does what people coming to Bett always want. People coming to Bett saying, okay, show me technology making learning better in a way that we can measure and demonstrate. And of course, blow me down, our little box does that, because once you realise that the light needs to be higher and we need to ventilate the room and get rid of the CO2 and so on, results get better. Bluntly, maths results, and we've got good data for maths, I think, more than for art or music, but For maths, the optimum temperature for learning, 18 to 21 degrees. Every degree over 21, maths results get worse, and it's a straight line. I mean, not a vertical line, but every degree you go up, maths goes down. So by the time you get to 23 degrees, the kids are 1.8, 2% worse off than they were in a cooler room. So you've literally got kids at the moment going into an exam room, and the kids who are sitting by the window in good light with ventilation are probably doing 2, 3, 4, 5% better than the kids on the other side of the room. Same kids, same paper, same school, same exam. And it just seems to me that one of the things technology can give us is that aggregation of marginal gains, because the marginal gains really matter. The D's to C's could be the difference between the school being closed or the head being sacked. The A's to B's, or B's to A's rather, the difference between that university place or this university place, and so on. So when just with the Olympics, when tiny differences make the difference between being on the podium or not, we jolly well ought to be focusing on the tiny differences. I mean, another trivial example, Sophie, is what should people eat before an exam? 900 million kids a year do exams. There's not a single paper saying what the best thing for breakfast is. I mean, we know that probably an energy drink is pretty catastrophic because the caffeine and the sugar, you're on a sugar high and then you fall down. The caffeine keeps you awake, but you can't remember why you're there. It's all pretty useless. And we know that no breakfast is worse than breakfast. But what's the best breakfast? There's some research we've just started in Spain at the moment. What would be a good brain breakfast? Never mind Red Bull. Where's my can of Grey Bull?
I mean, I think we spoke about this before as well, and I remember when doing my own GCSEs, and there was like it's a big fad at the time that you would do really well if you ate a Lucozade energy tablet. So then obviously all the kids are like, this is going to really hit me over the line.
Yeah, and a lot of my generation went through undergraduate exams on Proplast tablets, trying to pump themselves full of caffeine because they couldn't remember a damn thing when they got in there. Lucky to be in the right room, never mind right paper, It's extraordinary, isn't it, that, generations go past and we're all, reaching out and guessing what might be the right thing. Now, I think what we've got with technology is a democratization of knowledge. I think kids now know what other kids are doing. They know what other classrooms look like. They've got their Skype bars at the back of the classroom and they're chatting to other kids on their line of longitude or their line of latitude. And it's a very different approach to, we're having lunch with the guys in Johannesburg. Let's see what we've all had for lunch. Or let me pass on my project to the East Coast of America, West Coast, onto Hawaii, round the back onto Hong Kong, back through Asia and home, and 5 other schools have done the project while I've been in bed, So kids really know what each other are doing, and technology's done that. And of course, one of the things, the genius now out of the bottle, if they know what the others are doing, they say, well, hang on a minute, Finland's just abolished all subjects, the whole country's gone over to project-based learning. Why aren't we doing project-based learning? When they look it up, it clearly works, and they're hungry for it because they want to do better learning. So we're in a world really where the top down, I guess if you look at Bett, I remember that, we used to get 70 or 80 ministers of education coming round and going back to write their policy. Now they're coming round to learn what's happening, and the policy's happening in the classroom, in the school, in the community. It's a bottom-up revolution, really. But that's only happening in the countries who are saying we want tomorrow and we want it now. It's not happening in the countries who are saying we want yesterday and we want it cheaper. And, there's a real split in the world between those two. We've just seen the PISA results came out as we're recording this. The PISA results came out within just a few days. And, one of the very big solid conclusions from PISA, a recommendation that came out from this round of testing is there should be less selection. Selection is damaging to children's progress. But at the same time, we've got a policy review going on from the department about grammar schools, which are quite obviously not going to help. But, that doesn't mean we need to go back to the kind of comprehensive post-grammar school days. We can look at how can we do this even better? What's the third millennium version of this look like? And of course, Piaget and Vygotsky and Bruner and all those good folk were very clear that kids, it's like a staircase. You can't do this before you do that. And, one thing comes before another, but they never attached that to ages. They never said you have to wait till 11 or you can't do that till 13. I mean, folk listening to this are their kids do their music grades. Nobody ever says you can't do your grade 8 piano until you're 14. You just do it when you're ready. Yeah. So I think the modern version of that is just let the kids go as fast as they can. And a lot of people are using around the world stage, not age. And it turns out to be hugely motivating. Whereas saying to a kid, I know you're bored, but we can't do that till next year, was pretty hopeless. So I don't think the debate is about grammar schools or comprehensive schools or what the last century looked like. The debate is, how can we make learning as good as it could possibly be? And that's about looking at the new research and the new evidence and the new cognitive science and the new technology, and crucially saying to the kids, come on, you be the researchers, tell us what works. And everywhere that happens is just dynamite,
I mean, it's really interesting hearing you talking about that, because, I mean, just thinking about the sort of cycles that we go through. And I know previously you were involved in sort of government working groups like Edtech. And last week I was at a government workshop that was actually run out of the biz and industry strategy part, where they want to appoint two new people dedicated to looking at Edtech. And obviously lots of the sort of frameworks that came out of that, I'm sure, are sort of throwbacks to Bett or Edtech. And so my question was, and I think you've kind of answered this, but where do you think change will come from? I mean, is it going to come from government or industry or parents or schools or students? And it sounds like the students are the kind of main one for you, but it must be an interesting process to see these kind of frameworks be built up and sort of fall away.
Well, I've worked with a lot of ministers. We go back a very long way. I mean, literally, we must be into the 30s or 40s now, and I don't think I've ever detected malice. They've always tried to do the right thing, which is very encouraging. And if you look back, the few that left their mark, Ken Baker with with proper training days, or and actually a focus on technology. I mean, he was the era of the BBC computer, but he really got it. And so on. Maybe Ruth. She probably gave us personalization, didn't she? Really, which was interesting. So it's very hard to pick ministers and say they made a difference. I remember a slightly depressing email from Estelle Morris, who I was hugely fond of. Used to be a PE teacher. I think all teachers loved her, and she said she'd never been able to make anything that worked into policy, apart from really the literacy stuff. And it was pretty frustrating. So, I think a lot of well-meaning ministers don't really add up to a change in direction. They add up to, little bits of tweaks here and tweaks there. But actually, real change comes from communities and parents, children and teachers. And I think technology has democratized this. So, in the days when I'm old enough to have written exams myself. We wrote Mode 3 CSEs in East London. I taught Black Studies. What we didn't know about people wearing leather gloves on the podium in the Olympic Games, and Eldridge Cleaver and the Black Panthers. And it was really important for black culture, for people to have a sense of their history and where they were going, as kids growing up in East London. And I remember that being, a very powerful thing. A lot of teachers got together, we wrote it. So a lot of change then was coming from teachers. And I remember when I had to tell the community that we weren't allowed to do these Mode 3s anymore. And they said, you mean we've got to do the same exams as people in Norwich? I don't know why they picked Norwich. And I said, yep. And they said, but there's nobody black in Norwich. I said, well, no, not so many. You're right. They said, what the hell would they know? And, so communities have been a part of this. And I think that all got a bit lost in the kind of industrialisation moments of education. Well, now that's back. And, the young teachers with their teach meets and so many other things, this Edtech podcast. UK EdChat in Australia, EdChat in America. People are exchanging and swapping effective ideas, and underneath them is a generation of kids powered with, the thousands of classrooms they're looking at on Pinterest and saying, "Blimey, I wish I had a classroom like that." And the forums and the, they've got the tools and they've got the information to be hungry for change. And woe betide the minister that stands in the way. And I think you've seen, I don't want to name names, but you've seen in recent history ministers who've stood in the way, ministers who haven't, and the ones who got out of the way and trusted children and kids will be remembered fondly, that's for sure. I would just say, ETAG set up Michael Gove, David Willett, Matthew Hancock, schools, universities, industry, and together they said insistently, whatever you come up with, guys, this has got to be fun. This has got to be, as Michael said, this has got to be fun. So they're parents, they understand that learning needs to be better, but it's not them. It's kids and communities and teachers, and get out of the way and let them go. Let them go as fast as they can. And I think if I look back over my fairly lengthy career, the times when our most successful project happened were, to be honest, Sophie, when I woke up in the middle of the night trembling with fear that I'd gone too far. Oh my goodness, Stephen, you've gone too far.
I can't imagine you thinking that.
Oh, well, we did some pretty brave stuff,
Yeah.
21,000 head teachers online with 3 days' notice. We did some pretty brave stuff, and it was only the project that scared even me that were ambitious enough to be successful. And, I think for the Department of Education, for our ministers, realizing that out of fear comes progress is a big thing for them to, at the moment, of course, everybody's risk averse and they're running around with a pocket full of KPIs trying to measure the unmeasurable.
Maybe it could be the new barometer. So if it makes you tremble in fear, then it proceeds.
Well, Sophie, there's quite a lot of things make me tremble, so I'm not sure how good that would be.
So just going on from that, so what I was trying to hope to identify, is both your biggest influences, so that could just be in your life generally, and some of those biggest influences within education, if you're sort of thinking about the pedagogical side of it, or people that have inspired you.
Sure. So I've mentioned this, I think, a couple of times before, but I started teaching in East London. I was given a class of boys who'd been entered for O-level in a subject that in those days schools were judged on who was entered, not who passed, So these poor kids had all been entered for an O-level and no hope of passing it. And I picked them up 2 terms into a 5-term course, and they knew nothing. I'm not even sure they could spell the name of the subject. And as it happened, I was really good at the subject. And I said, look, come on, lads, I can get you through this. I know what you need to know. But I don't know how to teach because I've just started. I was doing my teacher training part-time in the evenings. I said, so at the beginning of each lesson, you give me 5 minutes, watch other teachers, tell me what's effective and what isn't, and then the rest of the lesson, I'll tell you how to pass the subject. By the way, all but one of them passed the O-level and walked out with this one certificate saying, I told them we could do it. I said I'd go an O-level, which was brilliant. But I learned so much from them because to begin with, they were just looking for how could you terrify boys. I said, you've got to do Arthur Harvey. You've got to do like Arthur. When he gets cross, he gets quiet, and it's really scary, And then they started looking at it in much more depth. And of course, what kicked in was that metacognition, the learning about learning. They became reflective practitioners, and that's why they became great learners. So, I think right from the start, my main pedagogic influences were seeing the world through the eyes of the learners themselves, and that didn't change when we were, running Not School for Kids, 1,000 kids a year who've been excluded from school, and so many other projects. It was always really their wisdom, and I think now, I'm sitting here as a granddad in a house full of grandchildren again. They've all lived with me, and 2 of them live with me, and I see now how fast and far they can go, when people get out of their way and let them. And I think one of the things we've learned from technology is you do so much, you make movies earlier than you could, you create music earlier than you could, you do great artwork earlier than you could, and we haven't allowed kids to do great learning earlier than they could. They still have to wait till 18 to go to university and so on. And I think it's very clear, working with very young children, that they could go a hell of a lot faster in the education system, given half a chance, and technology is the tool that lets them get there. So, my earliest influence was kids, and my current influence is kids, and in every case is what they do with the technology in their hands that make me sit up and take notice.
And so what would be the implications if people to learn more quickly? Would they be, straight out into the workplace more quickly, or would they, have, time to do more community-based work? I mean, it would just be interesting to ponder on how that would affect everything if that was the main mode of learning.
Yeah, and it would affect everything in all sorts of ways. But I mean, Sophie, most of what you were doing at 25, 17-year-olds do these days, so,
Yep.
yeah, and that's just the way the world is,
Yeah.
so, but actually, well, you have, and it's going to get worse, or better, depending on your perspective. But, we were building a school in New South Wales. I had a lot of children in for a big public meeting. We had 227 children sitting in front of us, and I said to them all, when do you think you're ready to go to university to study the subject you're passionate about? Never mind whether you can cook, never mind if you can do snogging or drive a car, never mind all that. Just when you're ready to go and study the subject you love at degree level. Not one of the 227 children said, I think I should wait till I'm 18. Typically they were 15, 16. I'm ready now. One of them said he was 14. Then he said, actually, most of what I did this year I knew already. I could have gone last year. So he thought he could have been off at 13. So why wouldn't they go when they're younger and then do more with what they've learned? We're desperate for kids to do grounded work with their undergraduate degrees, to be out in the workplace learning how to apply the knowledge and physics and 3D modeling and big data algorithms that they're learning. Why shouldn't they just do that earlier and get out there and make a difference? Or, why wouldn't they have a PhD by 21 rather than have to wait, more and more years? I mean, let's just let them go and see how fast. And that's be a nice problem to have, wouldn't it?
So on that front, what are you enjoying reading about currently?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, because I'm just rereading two things. I'm reading back through some of the early, key authors of education, really, John Holt, Ivan Illich, people like that. And I'm sort of saying to myself, if they'd have had technology, what might they have written? And that's kind of interesting to read. John Holt, good example, pivotal author, and a lot of American listeners will know well. And when you read it, like a third of the book is like, that's absolutely right. 2/3, so off the mark, And I think there was a lot in Montessori and Steiner learning that isn't a million miles away from the project-based, mixed-age, open-ended learning of today. Apart from they didn't quite get technology right, and. So I'm enjoying that, but I'm also just rereading some early science. I just read a lot of H.G. Wells, and I'm enjoying looking at their wrong assumptions about the future of technology, because I think it helps us to be clear about how hard it is to guess the future. We know the future is going to be different. We don't necessarily know what it's going to be, and sometimes it's nice to be reminded of that. And I've just read, for example, the Crack and Wakes, which is a particularly enjoyable. Actually, the War of the Worlds is pretty interesting for folk listening to this, because Martians land, start walking all over the earth and executing people with ray guns and so on, but nobody knows because there's no telephone, there's no telegram, there's no mass communication.
That would sort the problem out. You'll be on Twitter,
Exactly. I mean, 20 minutes on Twitter, and somebody would have nipped in and sorted out the Martians. But the point was, everything H.G. Wells wrote about was about, the impact of technology on society, but he failed to anticipate the communication bit. So it's actually quite quite good to reread all that stuff. It's humbling because it helps us to be a little realistic about our own predictions.
Yeah, that's always a good thing. I mean, so what was my next question? Can you tell us a little bit about some of your international schools and projects? So we've talked a little bit about what's happening here, but finding out a bit more about what you're doing elsewhere.
Well, I mean, they vary so much. And of course, if you think England is varied or the British Isles are varied, you should see the world. Well, I know if you have seen the world, but, it's a very different place. And I'm a professor in Madrid these days, as I think everybody knows, in UCJC, as well as here in Bournemouth in England. And Spain is a very different place. It suffered the most catastrophic economic collapse and is coming forward at that with real optimism. We've just taken on, at UCJC, a dozen undergraduates from mostly from Syria, some from Iraq and Afghanistan, to finish their degrees, And hearing from them about the world they've left is pretty humbling. One of them was saying, we had a big event in the middle of Madrid just a few weeks back, and he was saying, he said he'd actually started, one of the boys said he'd actually started university, being there a day, and they bombed the university, and climbing out over the bodies of your classmates is a pretty humbling thing. You kind of sit down outside and you cry, not for your classmates, you cry for yourself, because your future's pretty much gone. And then suddenly there he was. And what was nice about the lad was he quoted at the end Nelson Mandela, and he said, we can change the world with learning. Well, I think folk listening to this will know I always say we can mend the world with learning. We really can, So kids with the most desperate circumstances, the most horrific past experiences, they don't look back. They don't look back. They just kind of rub their eyes and say, right, let's really make the best of this going forward. And, I think a lot of the most exciting learning projects around the world take place in the most desperate circumstances, the poorest places, the highest unemployment, the worst violence. But for me, one of the excitements in the last 5 years has been to see some of the front-running schools, Emmanuel College down there in South Australia, fabulously wealthy place, although with a very big indigenous scholarship program, completely transforming their learning so that the school looks more like, to be honest, parts of the school look more like Google's offices than a school, with writable walls, coffee bars and sofas, and, they've just gone for it, right in the heart of Eton. Surely the poshest school in England, they're still wearing quite ridiculous clothes, but they've still got a wall with writable desks and writable surfaces and all glass and high levels of light and all the things that the poorest schools have been doing. So suddenly, the poshest schools are copying what's been hugely effective in some of the poorer, most difficult areas. And, that's very encouraging for me, because that seems to suggest this is all going to happen on a large scale.
Two-way learning from one another.
Absolutely learning from one another, and also suddenly thinking, blimey, have you seen how fast those kids with no chance are going? We better get our act together and shape up, I
was having a little dig around your Be Very Afraid part of your website as well. What's that all about?
Well, that goes back to yet another kind of little bit of government policy. I mean, I spent a lot of time in government policy, really, which is nice or scarring, depending on how you view it. But I was talking to, I think it was David Normington, or was it Michael Bishard, the permanent secretary in the department at the time, a long way back. And they said something along the lines of, well, we're putting a lot of technology in school, but we're not really sure what's happening. What are they doing with it? So I said, well, I'll get a few kids in and we'll set up a kind of room in Church House over the road from the Department of Education, and you can come and talk to the kids and see what they're doing. And we brought kids in who were, making movies and doing extraordinary stuff, really, for the time. This was ages ago, of course. And the dear old permanent secretary, I said, so what do you think? Is this, have you learned anything? And I'm sure it was David, said, frankly, my boy, I'm terrified, with a big smile on his face. He'd had a lovely afternoon. And I said, well, it's a very good thing for civil servants to be frightened once a year. Let's get the kids in every year and show you the cutting edge of what the best kids are doing. And blimey, it was amazing stuff, We had 17-year-olds who were impacting on the Brazilian election. We had kids doing moonshots. I mean, well, getting stuff up into space anyway. It was pretty humbling. And each year we'd arrange this event, usually in BAFTA. We ran it in BAFTA, I think, and we'd have famous people, movie stars and TV stars and sort of lovies in general really would come along and make a big fuss of the kids, and the kids felt pretty good. But then other kids around the country would have a look at what they were doing. Oh, funny enough, I was just showing the other day something from, I think must have been pretty early in the series, was Max Brzezinski, who used to be the deputy head at Loughborough College, and he'd asked his kids, if you ever see good learning going on, whip out your mobile phones and film the good learning and make a little movie of it, and before we start each staff meeting, we'll watch your video of what you think good learning looks like. And blimey, that must have been 10, 15 years ago. I still go into schools now where they're trying to confiscate the phones. And I think, stupid fools, because the phones are there as a great way to help the kids communicate with how to make learning better. And anyway, they're great data capture devices. And I don't know how you do science these days without a phone in your pocket, But those Be Very Afraid events were running some years ahead of what the country was doing. And they scared policymakers and journalists into saying, hey, this is good stuff, we should be moving faster. And I regret really that we don't still do them at the national level, but lots of people just run their own events now. I was in one in Melbourne a while back. I was in one in, which by the way was subtitled, Be Very Afraid, Listen to Learners. I was in one on Jersey. They had one out in Michigan not so long ago. So, little one-off Be Very Afraids are all running, and on the website you can download a manual and run your own. It's kind of do it yourself.
Very cool, and you can also sort of see the past entries, can't you? So
yeah, of course, they're all there. They still look pretty cutting edge, some of that stuff today. And if it was happening 10 years ago and you're not doing it now, come on, shape up,
Yeah, people looking at it can be afraid as well, what they're missing out on.
The fascinating thing about the kids, they'd set up the night before, and then we'd all take them out for a big meal somewhere grand, But the primary school kids would set up and go straight to the undergraduates. They didn't muck around when they're going to the secondary school kids. They went straight to the undergraduates. They wanted to learn the best stuff on offer. And, and they were just ambitious to do, the 9-year-olds wanted to do what the 21-year-olds were doing. Not the 15-year-olds. They were so ambitious. We used to run a little stop frame animation of the day. You could see the kids running to the stands of the biggest people in the room, saying, show us what you're doing then, show us your code. And I think we learn from that about kids' ambition even today.
I think that brings us about to time. If people aren't already following you on Twitter, how can they follow you there?
Well, if you get into these things early, you get to use your own name. So I'm at Stephen Heppell, Stephen with a PH, Heppell, on Twitter, no spaces. Google Stephen Heppell, you'll find me. My website is heppell.net, and on Pinterest, I'm Stephen Heppell. So I'm all over the place as me, so I'm pretty easy to find, really. And I'd just like to thank people for listening to this. It's an exciting time, I think, for most of the folk listening. This is going to be the best ever decade for learning. It's going to be extraordinary. The most fun probably you'll have certainly with your clothes on. And what a decade it's going to be. And it's us, learning professionals, and our kids that are going to grab hold of this and change the world. We're going to mend the world with learning. We're going to do it with the technology in front of us. We're going to do it by trusting children. And we're going to do it by being a little scared in the middle of the night. That adds up to something pretty nice, Sophie, I reckon. Thanks for your questions.
Coolio. That was absolutely brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And hopefully I'll come and find you at Bett as well. Which
lovely to see you again. We can do baby racing. I can bring the grandchildren.
Yeah, it's good fun. I did a bit of that this morning. So, yeah. Awesome. Well, have a good afternoon, Stephen. Appreciate that.
Right. Bye. Bye now.
What a brilliant chat. Thanks for listening, everyone. And if you enjoyed that, don't forget you can subscribe to the Edtech podcast on iTunes, Stitcher and Pocket Cast, and find us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. Have a brilliant week and check out next week's episode on dyslexia and technology. Bye-bye.